Thanks very much, John. Let's start the conversation, and let me start it off by poking at Iain slightly. First, it's not so much putting you on the spot, but it's more a question of what we've been told, and that is, and you alluded to it yourself, that everybody's doing it. As John said, the French were only upset that they hadn't done it first. They hadn't got to the famous Merkel.
How do you know?
Mobile phone. Good point. We might put that one to so, is everyone doing it? And is it just the case that the Americans have got much more technology and the British have got a bit more technology than everybody else, which allows them to do it more comprehensively, but actually everybody is doing it or wishes to do it? Is that the situation?
Well, the first answer, that honest answer to that is I don't know. The second answer is I suspect that the numbers of states capable of doing it with any level of sophistication is relatively small. And you're talking about China's and Russia's and France and the United States and Britain. I mean, fairly few states, for example, have separate foreign intelligence services, which Britain does, the Americans do, the Russians do, the Chinese do, but there aren't that many. The French do. So when it comes to signals intelligence capability, I simply don't know and wouldn't like to speculate beyond those more general observations. But you're right that big powers like to be better informed when they come to make heavy-duty foreign policy decisions, and there's no question that much of the agenda since the end of the Cold War, after a quiet period at the beginning of the 90s, once the Balkans flared up and the question of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction became a major issue, and then terrorism, that those are all subjects on which open sources by themselves are not going to provide as much light as you need as a state with the power of the United States. And however much, I must throw in, however much we're right to be alarmed by what the United States have managed to achieve with the NSA, I think watching the news pictures yesterday of what that aircraft carrier is doing off the Philippines, we need to remind ourselves that the American capacity, the scale of the American commitment globally and its defense commitment is so huge and so dwarfs everybody else's. They've got 10 of those aircraft carriers, I think, in current service. Mm-hmm. They're like enormous mobile airfields with helicopters in numbers that just take your breath away, able to deliver humanitarian aid to the most ghastly circumstances. And it seems to me, if we forget that side of the American capability and simply focus on the NSA, we're making a terrible mistake.
In our case, going back, in the UK's case, and John Micklethwait was fairly clear that we are less in or should be less in the dock than the United States. Nevertheless, as Charlie Faulkner, Lord Faulkner, said in The Guardian this morning, the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, which you referred to, which was drawn up in 2000, and the assumption in that was that investigation, listening to people, would be individuals, and you'd need for that, when the security services listened to somebody, it would be somebody, and it would need a judge to sign a warrant. Now, as Faulkner said, we're doing it in bulk. We're bulk buying, or the security services are bulk buying, and therefore, in a sense, they're operating outside of the law because the law hasn't caught up with them. Is that fair?
This is a very difficult area. I don't think it is entirely fair. It's a question of the haystack that was described by Iain Lobban in the public session, and the ability of GCHQ to be able to interrogate bulk data in order to do the more intrusive surveillance of actually reading the contents of the communications. What is not happening, I am absolutely sure, is that people are sitting in Cheltenham reading this bulk, doing the mass surveillance as it's described by Chris Huhn and others, in terms of reading everybody's emails and everybody's correspondence one by one until they happily come across a terrorist and think, oh, we can do something about that. What they are doing is reading very small numbers of content against individual warrants signed by a foreign secretary, But in order to be able to get at that content, they are, if you like, downloading or making available to themselves massive quantities of data that they can then interrogate for this more detailed interrogation when they know that that is the place in the haystack to look. So it's a question of mastering the haystack, if you like, and being able to get into it. That is what they have done, and it may be that there wasn't adequate public discussion of that at the time they were doing it, and of course the scale of it, because of the scale of data now, is so huge. It's a troubling fact. But what it isn't is mass surveillance, I think, of the kind that some of the media are trying to conjure up, of the sequential reading of everybody's emails one after another. That's not happening. Last
question to you. As we said, the heads of the three main security services appeared last week before the Parliamentary Committee on Security. Actually, Faulkner in his interview this morning cast some doubt on whether or not they were being wholly accurate. Not that they were they're lying, but he did cast doubt, and others have cast doubt, on the lengths to which they went in order to say this was a disaster. Are you are you sure that what they said, this is a disaster, that Al-Qaeda is rubbing its collective hands in glee, all of that is right, do you think? Or were they over-egging it a bit?
Well, again, I don't know that because I'm not party to their secrets. But from my knowledge of those agencies and of the world in which I worked, I think it is unlikely that they may be, I think it's most unlikely that they are over-egging it. And again, I come back to the point that unless you know the operational details of the particular operations that might be compromised, you can't, from a distance, make a judgment about how damaging that is.
That seems to be, just to go over to the three editors, that seems to me to be the core of it. What Iain Mathewson said earlier was, he was giving his 5 minutes worth, was that it's intellectually disingenuous for an editor, no matter how distinguished, how aware of the secret world, to know what to redact, to know with certainty that what he is putting out in the paper will not be picked up by terrorists who want to harm us and used, will not contain a nugget of knowledge which would help them. What do you say to that? Can you be absolutely certain that your judgment is right, you who don't know, haven't worked in the security world?
The short answer is no. However, we can exercise prudence. I think that's what it comes down to. The short answer is no, won't know everything. Omniscience is not allowed any man, let alone the security services. I don't pretend to that, but I can be prudent.
But prudent on the basis of what, Michael? Prudent on the basis of knowledge? Prudent on the basis of an understanding of the secret world?
Prudent on the basis of experience, of knowledge that our reporters have gained, on the basis of the pleas which I took from government agencies not to publish, or not to publish then. I think we can be prudent.
Sylvie, what do you say to that? Can you be sure? Were you sure when you published WikiLeaks?
No, you cannot be sure 100%. But for WikiLeaks, it was different. We did redact a lot of stuff. I mean, we took out all the names, the addresses that sometimes, there were other indications than names, like the brother or the cousin or the address. We took all that. That was a very cumbersome job to do, and we did it. Actually, after a few months, Assange, I think I forgot which group, but some foreign group got hold of the documents and published everything, and then Assange himself just put everything online, which was completely crazy. But I think since everything had been already more or less in the open, I don't think there were serious consequences because I think people who were involved or who could have been at risk probably were already under protection. Or anyway, with the NSA documents, it's difficult for me to say because I haven't, Le Monde only had a very tiny part of it, those related to France, and the whole pack of documents. I have no idea how much, how many there are. But I would be surprised if everything will be published. I don't think so. I think. Again, probably the people who have those documents are exercising their judgment. And as Michael said, the editor's judgment is based on experience, and I think these are people who really think before they act, editors, and they are not. So it's also part of, as we said earlier, it's also part of our job to bring things into the open, and we weigh the consequences, of course, and I think we do exercise judgment before we publish things.
John, you were pretty categorical that in the end the editor should decide. But this is against a context where, the security services, as you admitted, are warning that terrorism is a very real possibility. We've had it in this country and in France and in the United States, and also where the nightmare scenario is constantly brought up that a terrorist group will get hold of weapons of mass destruction and cause a vast horror. Against that, are you still sure that your judgment, or the judgment of editors who publish these things en masse, is the one that should be taken as the final?
I'm not sure, but my prejudice is in that direction. I think Ian's exactly right. It is completely intellectually disingenuous of editors to claim they know absolutely, and I don't think most of them do, though, to be fair. And I think in the end you're dealing with two evils, and it's a very, very hard one to push. On the one hand, you definitely must have the risk somewhere that Alan Rusbridger will let one thing through which could get somebody into trouble. That's on one side. On the other side, I think you have a system where the ability to say exactly what does go through and what doesn't go through is down to the security service. I think that is something which is exactly what the security service was set up to protect. That's the liberal society that we want to hang on to. I think, again, actually targeting on the Americans, I think there is also a particular thing where if you abuse the system as badly as they did, to some extent you forfeit whatever, you're bound to be treated with more suspicion by editors. In my experience, editors on the whole are relatively grown up about this. Sometimes they get bees in their bonnets. I don't think there's any denial about that. But on quite a lot of these issues, there's an element of give or take, and it goes through. So there is no perfect answer. If you came up with an answer which said that, for the sake of argument, MI6 had the right to stop anything going through, that I think would be profoundly illiberal. If, on the other hand, you hand it over to editors, they're possibly the least bad option. But as I said, the three of us on this side of the table have a vested interest in declaring that. So, as a least bad option, we should probably let Iain come in to say where we are.
Last word from the podium, Fitzpatrick, and then we'll go out to you.
3 points very briefly. First of all, I think I was a German, and until 25 years ago, had in East Germany, enjoyed having everything listened to by the Stasi. I would take a pretty dim view of the way the NSA and others have behaved. I think the German attitudes on this are wholly understandable. Germany may be pretty tiresome sometimes about the extent to which it's prepared to talk a bigger game internationally than it's prepared to play. But I think on this particular issue, my sympathies are with Chancellor Merkel and her colleagues. Secondly, on WikiLeaks, what surprises me is that during this debate, and I speak as somebody whose views on Mr. Putin were shared by WikiLeaks with a wider audience, rather sensible views, if colourful. But I think if there had been one or two obvious examples where WikiLeaks had compromised our security in this country or others, they'd have been pulled up in this debate. I think we'd have been told, you see what happens when you allow this information to get into the public realm. It compromises this or that interest, it leads to this or that agent being bumped off. I'm just surprised if WikiLeaks was such a big issue that none of that has been used in this debate. And thirdly, we did have in this country, admittedly not with a debate about big data or whatever, we did have a period of 20 or 25 years during which we were endlessly having to balance security and liberty in Northern Ireland and back here. And on the whole, where we operated with a rather attenuated view of civil liberty, we did so under the law. Almost in every case where we compromised on liberty, we screwed up our security. On all the big issues where we actually backed off a traditional view on what liberty means, we increased the support for the IRA and increased, in my view, the length of the IRA campaign. And that surely is a general lesson about the point that John made, liberty and security, which we shouldn't lose sight of.
Let's go over to you. There's a microphone. Please speak into it because this is being recorded for the NSAs. Down here, first of all. And please introduce yourself.
Hello, Richard Sandberg from Cardiff University. I wonder if I could ask the panel about scrutiny and oversight, because when many people believe the security services may have overreached themselves, a view which, frankly, the Select Committee open session did very little to dispel the notion there wasn't sufficiently robust oversight of them. How do you resolve this conundrum when scrutiny can't offer the transparency that would reassure the public? Any scrutiny has to be behind closed doors. So how can we restore public faith that oversight of the intelligence services is sufficiently robust?
This is presumably largely for Iain Mathewson.
Well, I don't know.
No.
Anybody else want to come in rather than Iain?
Could I just say on that you're right, that clearly oversight needs to be strengthened. Actually, it has just been strengthened. It's rather curious that the open session was going to happen and got tangled up with Snowden, as it were. That was a process that was evolving anyway. But the most important thing, against which many people in the secret world argued for a long time, that has changed in oversight, is that the operations of the three agencies are now themselves the subject of the intelligence and security services remit. And that is genuinely important. The other thing is that, having seen quite a lot of the oversight in operation through the late 90s and early noughties, it has actually already been much more substantial than the print journalists have given it credit for, and that is readable in their annual and other reports. And I'm very struck, I have to say, by how little read the volume of material provided by our Oversight Committee to the public is, and how little known it is, even amongst those journalists who are obliged to cover it. Part of the problem is when an annual report comes out, the journalists will take what they think is the biggest story out of it, and they will write that, and it'll be probably normally an inside page story, and then it goes away. The report is 70 pages long, and there will be 7 or 8 other quite significant criticisms and observations about the agency world within it that do reflect and did reflect significant challenge. You're right, it's got to be stronger, but it has actually been already quite significant. It will become much more significant now that operations are within their purview.
The defence...
remember to introduce yourself.
Yes, sorry. Paul Flather, I'm at Mansfield College. I wondered about the defence. The defence is we need the haystack to find the needle. And it seems to me that this might work as a defence if we collectively, the country, the demos, agree. And I don't think we ever did. And secondly, it works, and it's the point that Richard Sandberg just made, if we had proper oversight, and clearly we haven't, because we've learnt so much new material. It's not the detail, but it's the extent and range of it. And I think that justifies this action by Edward Snowden. I mean, no longer can we say, hang on, everything's under control, gov. That won't work anymore. The elite sort of talking to itself and handpicking the people that sit on the various committees, which happens, I think, in America, Professor Parks. There's a secret committee with, and the people who pick the people who sit on the committee are themselves not very well known, and you don't know who's on it, and all that sort of stuff has all emerged. And this whole thing that's emerged over the weekend about the planting of questions. I mean, that's emerged after the three gentlemen appeared before the House of Commons. So that, somewhat the headline today, it's all a big pantomime. If we agree that it's justified, then how we treat Edward Snowden is put into a different light, it seems to me. He's not a traitor, he's more a Democrat, and he's certainly a whistleblower. So one ought to feel very differently. I gather he's very short of money, and perhaps we should have a whip round and send him something.
Shall we get some more people in before we come back?
Andrew Graham, Balliol. A couple of observations and then a question. When I first started working on the internet about nearly 20 years ago now, one of the things I learned early on from computer sciences was that the chances of information leaking depend almost entirely on two numbers. One number is how much is the information worth, and the other number is how many people know. Well, given that if your state is breaking the law, that's quite a big bit of value of information. And given that 850,000 people knew, it's bound to be out. It's bound to be out. And the Americans and other ought to have been smart enough to think about that. Nothing to do with the Guardian. It wasn't leaked by the Guardian. It was leaked by the NSA. Yep. There are people who ought to be accused of breaking, treason. The second point is this extraordinary complacency, and nobody seems to have connected the fact that there was another story that the Guardian was running, rather than WikiLeaks and this. It ran the phone hacking story. And that stayed almost invisible until the Billy Dowler case came out. And then everybody suddenly got very upset. Well, what was Murdoch doing? He was doing what the NSA was doing, but something we didn't like. And of course there's a point there, which is there are lots and lots of things that we're all doing, which are entirely legal, but we don't want to have in the public domain. And what this NSA stuff is doing and opening up all these back doors is giving the potential for massive blackmail and influence and corruption to loads and loads of people by knowing little private things about you that stop you getting a job, or get you a job, or cause you to make some payments. That's the corruption of society that's taking place. Those are the two observations. Question about the defence that's put up by the three heads of the relevant security services. We sort of have the debate begins and it doesn't go on. What they say is, this must be very damaging. Well, I've got enough imagination to think how it might be damaging. If you were just about to suck up plot B, C, and D, and then suddenly these plots know that they're being watched, they'll go underground, you don't get them. And that's damaging. But nobody goes on to ask the question, suppose that the terrorists learn from this that there's nothing that they can transmit digitally at all, they're going to be pretty inefficient. I mean, most corporations in the world wouldn't want to be in a situation where they couldn't these days transmit anything internationally and digitally. They'd be back to pen and paper. Well, if you're pushing the terrorists back to pen and paper, you must be gaining an enormous amount as well as losing a little bit. Nobody seems to have put that into the equation. Should it be in the equation?
Everything is aimed at Iain Mathewson at the moment, and he's a man of
Sphinx.
a man of frail and nervous disposition, so I don't want to. Perhaps we should go over to the panel and ask for their reaction to this. John, do you want to?
Well, I'll try and defend Iain a bit. I think on the oversight, I think Richard Sandberg's question is a very, very good one. Is what kind of oversight have we had in Britain, and is it substantial enough? I think the issue of the planting questions was a bad thing for the committee. Against that, I think there is some degree of self-correction that happens in this, is that if you have a performance sadly I wasn't in the country, but I got bits of it on television. If you have a performance where the parliamentary oversight seems to be rather wimpish and useless, and then you have these further revelations about the questions, I think there is a degree of self-correction that will happen through that, and this is not a defence of everything that's happened in the past, but I suspect the questions will be tougher in the past. And I think there is very few ways, if you really look at how you do oversee security services, there's very few ways in which they could work with any degree of usefulness without having some kind of political overlord who is allowed to interview them in secret and vice versa. Because once you make the whole thing open, then it gets much harder. So I suspect on the British side, that there's a chance at least of it sort of muddling towards what should be the compromise, which is they are overseen by parliamentarians, and it is sort of accurately manifested there. I do think this issue about the haystack and the ability to find things in it is where a lot of the really hard questions are sitting, because it's extremely difficult to think of a way that if companies can use the haystack to find out stuff, it seems rather weird to ban security services from doing it. It's more that you want to punish people, I think, extremely for areas when they go over the edge. Why the man who dared to lie to the Senate still sits as head of America's thing, I cannot believe. It's pathetic by Obama. The same token, I think the people at the NSA who used this sort of stuff to go and spy on their ex-girlfriends, or perhaps their future girlfriends, they know everything, I think they should be punished actually really severely. Because I think in exchange for having given people the power to do this stuff, then you have to police it. But I don't see many ways around that thing of firstly trusting your elected representatives to police this in a more comprehensive way than the Americans have done, and probably a slightly tougher way than we've done so far. And then secondly, having very punitive barriers to people who abuse it. I think that's probably your two best, but it doesn't entirely answer people's questions.
Sylvie,
I would like to address also the issue of trust. You see, we mentioned the Google, the brilliant Economist cover about Google this week. And I think somebody said it's not related to NSA. I think it is related to NSA. It's all part of the same issue of this. We are now aware. We have taken the measure of the scale of big data. And I must say, most people are very ambivalent about what they are doing with their data. I mean, all our teenagers, and not only teenagers, also adults, put all their private life on Facebook. What will happen when this generation of teenagers goes into looking for employment? And their prospective employers, start to dig into what they have been putting on the internet. These are things most young people are not aware of or are not conscious of. But one of the merits, I think, of this NSA affair has been to shed some light on this and on the consequences of having all these data uncontrolled. I have been speaking with some people working in high-tech companies, in big internet companies recently, and they are working to join forces to ask the American administration to reform the Patriot Act. That would be a good way to start to restore trust, I think, both for users and for foreign government. Also, the European Parliament and a lot of European Commission representatives have been and European governments have been trying to get answers from the American administration. So far, there haven't been many answers coming, and I think a more open attitude would definitely help to restore trust also at government level.
Michael.
Just a couple of quick points. our legislators were asleep. They should have known, they should have been asking questions. And we've seen them on the Sunday talk show saying, I didn't know. If Senator Feinstein of the state of California didn't know, she should be not re-elected. If the Republican congressman from Michigan, who chairs the House Intelligence Committee, didn't know, he can go run a bar in Detroit. They weren't doing the job. Last time this happened in a big way was in the 1970s, and the Church Committee undertook an examination of what the intelligence agencies were doing, and that led to some reforms. Is there public appetite now for reforms? Well, I don't know. The last opinion poll by Pew showed it was about 50-50. Good thing, bad thing. Good thing, bad thing. They were more upset about Angela Merkel's phone calls being intercepted than about the whole mining of data. So I don't know where it's going. At this point, the outrage is mostly on the Sunday talk shows.
Chris.
Well, just one point about accountability, on which Richard is entirely correct. There's an assumption in this country that if you want to have accountability in sensitive areas like security, then the way you do it is you choose a group of privy councillors, ex-cabinet ministers, and because they're privy councillors and have taken one particular oath, you can depend on their integrity and all that jazz. Well, there are a lot of people who are privy councillors who aren't ex-ministers. Members of the Supreme Court are privy councillors. You could perfectly well spice up the questioning of a body like the Oversight Committee by having 2 or 3 members of the Supreme Court or other judges on it. So I think there are lots of ways in which you can make the system of accountability much sharper and one in which we'd have a lot more confidence. The very good article by Alan Rusbridger in the New York Review of Books in the last issue finishes up with a long quotation from a judge about the imperfection of the present situation in which you have, in effect, an unaccountable service. And that's the sort of contribution which I think 1 or 2 sharp judges would bring to the whole question of accountability.
Last round of questions.
Tim Gardam from Sedans. I just want to ask both sides of the argument this question. There's an agreement, I think, that big data has fundamentally changed. It's a game changer. It's changed the terms of this debate. And yet when I listen to you, in many ways you're saying the same sorts of judgments apply. Iain has been saying you need to scour the haystack, but then when it comes to taking a particular action, you go and get the warrant and you proceed in the same way. The editors were saying the editorial judgment of the editor, making a discriminating judgment on a particular story, is the basis on which that story is published, which has always been the case. It seems to be the difference. We need to explore what the differences are that makes your judgment have to be reconsidered on both sides. And I'd be interested in Iain's response to what John said about the fundamental difference here is that the NSA were completely out of control of the number of people involved, and whether you agree with that. I'd also like to ask the editors, surely one of the issues that has changed is that this material is not the material of an investigative journalist piecing together a particular story, as happened in Northern Ireland all the time. I remember doing the UDR shoot-kill story, and then the security service coming on to you and saying, you're endangering security by publishing this story. You're in receipt of a huge amount of data which somebody else can release, and therefore you're not in control of it yourself. And I'm just interested to know, if you think about it, what are the greater difficulties in making the judgments you now make compared to before? So in what sense has data really changed things from the way it would have proceeded in the past?
Hi, David Levy from the Reuters Institute. It's a question to the editors, really. one of the features of much of this data is that it's global in terms of the scope of the material that it covers, and yet each of the editors has essentially said that one makes national decisions about what is and what isn't acceptable, and that there are very different cultures in different countries, as we've heard. So how does one reconcile responsible roles for editors in making those decisions with the fact that the material that one would be making judgments about is often, not always, but often may extend well beyond the territory within which you're making those judgments?
That's my question too.
Last question here.
Thank you. Keith Burnett from Chatham House. If the responsible editors on the panel won't publish, will new online blogs and other sources publish the next time?
Okay, let's go back and in reverse order to who spoke. John, do you want to pick up from any of these comments?
Okay, I'll go very quickly. On the international roles, yeah, I think you have to. I suppose the Economist is international, so we're stuck in that. So, but yes, you have to think internationally. The most rather unknown in Britain, but in a big deal in Bangladesh. About a year ago, we published there was a tribunal into horrific war crimes that happened in Bangladesh in the 70s. Mm-hmm. We were given transparently phone-hacked, not transparently, it was phone-hacked material that showed the various people involved who were trying it, talking to the prosecution, with the material sort of obviously coming from somewhere close to the defence but not being clear. And we published that on the basis that we thought that although the people in the dock were not particularly savoury people, they did not deserve that sort of justice. And you have to make decisions about what exactly it was. So I think editors, yes, they should. I think the question about what happens if you don't do it and it goes online, I think in the end, without sounding as if I'm giving up all responsibility for that, I think in the end that's up to you. You cannot control things beyond your control, and I suspect it's a weedy answer, but that's the starting point. Whether that's something which the law should follow, I don't know. I was going to say two things about the kind of issue of all this data out there. The first is that I think we still have not really come to terms with the amount of private data that is beginning to emerge. There's to use two examples involving Sylvie. One is that quite a long time ago, a day apart, two children were born in New York, which Sylvie and I were involved, sadly not together, but one being my twins, and one being her. By the time they are grown up, the amount of material which will be on them is untold, I think, and the amount of material somebody will be able to search about them. There's a very nice French line, which I hope I'm going to get right, that hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue, meaning that when you tell off your children for being useless, for doing things that you yourself have done, it is not obvious you can do that because it's a good thing to do. I suspect that will become much more difficult. The last point I wanted to make, which I think I'm not totally backing Iain on this, but I think it's something which people have to face up to, and a number of people have brought up, is that liberty is expensive. It's all very well saying it's very nice we all want to stop people being able to look at you down the street and telling who you are or whatever, all those things. Well, certainly in our arguments about that, a lot of people, particularly from the more technological sides of the Economist, came and said, well, how on earth are you going to do that? And the answer is you're only going to be able to do things. You're only going to be able to persuade Google and Facebook to turn privacy data settings up to very high as a default setting. That's going to cost them money. It's going to make the system less efficient. You're only going to do that if you really think that liberty is important. And I think with the Iain points, the really interesting question is that actually they could involve some people's lives at the border being endangered. And so if you sit there and say you want to back the liberty route, then you have to do that knowing that you're taking that risk. I'm happy doing that, but it's not something which you should do casually, I don't think.
Sylvie, if you've recovered from the romantic life.
I cannot compete with that. No, there's one word which I don't think we have pronounced tonight. It's values. And I do think that editors have values as strong as intelligence officials. So as we have said, I think all of us, we can't be 100% sure that we're not taking any risks and so on. But we also exercise our judgment based on values. And when the good, of putting out some material outweighs the bad of keeping it secret, well, these are decisions that we take based also on those criteria. And just one thing, if responsible editors don't publish this material, of course, that was a very obvious risk for WikiLeaks. That was an argument that we all used a lot, that if we didn't publish that material in the way we did, redacted and so on, then it would have been found online unredacted much earlier than it was. So that was obviously also a risk with the NSA material. We did, just one last thing, maybe that will address David's question. I think we never really put out material just raw. We also use our expertise, we use our we do investigate also as much as we can. It's just not transmitting material as such. That's what responsible editing and publishing is about, I think.
Values. That's a good point. As a journalist, particularly as an editor, I worked not on behalf of the US government, not on behalf of its intelligence services. I worked on behalf of the American democracy, the American people, who have a right to know and a need to know what's being done in their name. If you don't tell them, you're not doing the job.
Chris, do you want to last one?
Yeah, just one rather obvious point. I've always been struck by the extent to which some people assume that if you talk about values, you're spitting in the face of realpolitik. I think that's rubbish. The big meeting that President Obama had with President Xi Jinping a few months ago was one in which the main item on the agenda was American and Western concern about cyber espionage, cybercrime by Chinese authorities. Well, I tell you this, it'll be a long time before an American leader raises the issue of cybercrime with Chinese, whether it's commercial or state security. So, I sometimes think that you forget about values and you do realpolitik, real damage.
Last word to the man.
Well, thank you. If I remember, I think it was Tim Garden's question. It was the NSA out of control, and is the big game changer big data? Is big data a big game changer or not? On the first point, the scale and size of the American intelligence community looks to those concerned on the British side always frighteningly large. It is. And an alliance with this monster is extremely difficult and has proved pretty tricky through the years, satisfactory to conduct. Of course, signals intelligence is the bit that is most intimately unified, as it were. The relationship between GCHQ and NSA is unlike any other relationship between any other British government agency and US government agency. And to enormous degrees, it's been greatly to our advantage and our security in this country that alliance has endured and developed. I'm not going to defend what we can see of what NSA have done. I do worry that having managed to intercept Chancellor Merkel, and I agree entirely with Chris Patton that I'd be entirely on Merkel's and the German side on that question. But the upshot of it will be, what I fear it may be, is that the risk appetite for good intelligence collection operations that don't involve listening into the communications of your closest allies or their leaders will, that foreign secretaries and prime ministers will lose that appetite, because they will worry that they will read it on the front page of the Daily Mail or indeed the Guardian, and that they're just simply not prepared to take that risk. And balancing risk in intelligence collection is hugely important. So that's a real concern. On big data, I think you're right that it is the game changer. I would only caution that if you think of signals intelligence, I think part of the issue is that 25, 30 years ago, British telephone systems were entirely in the ownership of the British government. It was a state, one single state. It took us weeks to get new telephones, or months indeed, just as it did in East Germany. And probably shorter in East Germany because there was an interest in the state in providing a telephone than there was here. The multiplicity of communications, not just telephone communications, but internet protocol and all of that, and their passage into the private sector, means that GCHQ have had to cope with the thought that possibly, and I'm entirely speculating here, that if a terrorist chooses to use O2 rather than EE or something, they will go dark on them. And what the hell are they going to do about that? And that's very worrying. And the idea that a disclosure of that kind could be made by a Snowden-type figure is also very worrying, and one is not likely to learn subsequently that happened, because what interest would there be for GCHQ or NSA in telling the world that they suffered that piece of damage? It would just make a bad situation worse. So, yes, I think it is a game changer, but I do still argue, I think, that what GCHQ is seeking to do is to maintain their ability to patrol the haystack, just as they did when we just had dear old British Telecom.
On the one side, we've had, on this side and on that side, we've had people say that we do the job of informing the people. We sometimes may get it wrong, publish something which might be dangerous, but that's the price of liberty. On this side, we have the case being made for those who protect our security, who have said that we sometimes go too far, but that's the price of security. So that's been the debate. It's been pretty damned high level. We thank John Micklethwait, Sylvie Kauffmann, Marco Parks, the Chancellor, Lord Patton, who's chairman of our advisory committee and has spent much of the day with us, and last but not least, the man from Whitehall, or nearby, Iain. Thank you all very much.